Okay, well, I think we'll make a start. There's always a few more people going to be joining us, but we'll start just with the introductions. So, my name is Phil Cohen. I'm the research director of Livingmaps Network, and I've been one of the people responsible for putting together this series of events looking at the relationship between map making and war making. The first two events in the series, who began in October, looked at that relationship, that connection in rather broad terms. So I'm delighted that this evening we're going to kind of focus down a bit and examine that relationship between war making and map making in terms of a quite concrete, historically specific instance. And one in which the technologies of modernity, both in the context of map making and war making, became so much and so hideously in evidence, that connection. In other words, the so-called Great War. And so I'm delighted that this evening we have Keith Lilly, who really is a kind of leading authority in this field, to talk to us and to present the work that he's been doing over a considerable period investigating this in terms of the First World War. Keith is a professor of historical geography at Queen's University in Belfast, and he's made his particular kind of emphasis of his work is exploring, interpreting the relationship between historical landscapes, maps, and he directed an AHRC funded project, which was, I think, centered on, well, you tell us perhaps some more about it, the World War I Public Engagement Center. And the project was called Living Legacies 1914 to 18. And I think what's interesting about his work is that the way he has found of applying quite sophisticated, contemporary mapping technologies to exploring the sort of the granularity of mapping and war. And I think his work is quite unique in that way. So I'm really looking forward to hearing his presentation this evening. So how are we going to do this? Well, it's the usual sort of protocols for these events. So please do use the chat facility to make any comments or questions. I will be monitoring this. So when we come to the Q&A at the end, we can, we will obviously draw on that, and you can either speak or I can bring out the points that you want to make. So Keith is going to talk for about 50 minutes, and then we'll move to the Q&A. All right. So Keith, I think it's over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Phil. Really appreciate that, and it's great to be here this evening. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and thank you, Phil, for giving me this opportunity to talk about a project which, as you were mentioning there, funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, ran during the course of the centenary of World War I. So I think what we're going to be talking about this evening is quite fitting. I'm really pleased to hear that intro around war making and map making, because the First World War had a huge impact on map making, on the technologies of map making, particularly through aerial survey and new technologies around reconnaissance, as well as ground survey, which is something I'm going to be talking about, but also popularized, I think, as well, the consumption of maps, made in a sense maps more accessible to more people. But that's all down the line, so to speak. Behind the lines is really the top part of my title there, the main part of the title, behind the lines. And I'm sort of playing around with this bit of wordplay here, behind the lines from the Western Front, the battlefront, the lines of the battlefronts themselves, which is what we'll be looking at today, and the impact that they had on map making on the Western Front, but also behind the lines on the map. And this is something I'm particularly interested in looking at and have been working on now for a fair while, it has to be said. So behind the lines, trying to understand the processes that lead up to the creation of the map image. I think often we're somewhat fixated, maybe even fetishizing the image of maps. You know, we use them in book covers, we put them on our walls, we buy them, etc. You know, so we tend to fetishize the map image. And what I'm interested in is what lies behind the lines on the map, hence the title, Behind the Lines, and what they mean. Okay, so when we look at a map image, it depends which theoretical point of view you want to take, but many would say it's the end of the process of the map maker. You know, it's the final product. There's a lot of before that decision making going on into making what ends up being on the map. Of course, as Brian Harley, a historical geographer like myself, but he wrote, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this kind of work around deconstructing the map and the power of maps, recognizing that maps are not neutral, that they are culturally embedded, they carry belief systems and so on and so forth, though they're politicized. So we know we can begin to deconstruct the map and think about what lies behind the map in that more kind of conceptual sense, but I'm also interested in what lies behind the map on the ground and how map making involves working through a series of practical practices in the field, and how maps are kind of born through field work. And that again relates back to my interest in geography. I am an historical geographer. I've always been in the field and discipline of geography. So behind the lines, then I'm playing around with that title, frontline mapping. I hope this fits reasonably well with the overall theme of the Livingmaps Network events, which Phil was just talking about. So I'm hoping it sort of, you know, helps the conversation, if you like, around this topic, even though it is quite specific, as you were saying, Phil, quite a sort of historical example in many ways. I am interested in using spatial or geospatial technologies of the 21st century in looking at maps of the past, whatever period that might be, in this case, early 20th century, but I've used those technologies for looking at the maps as well, right back to the medieval period. And also interested particularly in field surveying and the practices and processes of surveying the field, and how that is influenced by the landscape, but also how those processes and practices feed into the map making itself. So anyway, that's a bit of background, if you like, or an explanation of what I'm about. I just wrote these couple of images. I'm really delighted to be here. Living maps. I live maps. You know, surely all of us on this call live it. We all live maps. We love maps. We live maps. Maps have been a really important part of my life. They still are professionally. I'm very fortunate to have that position at Queen's and to be able to do research in this area. I really appreciate that. But it's something which is quite sort of germane to me. So those letters actually on the left-hand side from the Ordnance Survey. I wrote to the Ordnance Survey. I think I was about 11 or something like that. And they very kindly responded, and there was exchanges obviously well before emails and so on and so forth. And then, you know, more recently, I've been out in the field looking at the traces of surveyors, particularly the Ordnance Survey surveyors, in the landscape. And an article came out in the Council for British Archaeology publication. I'm a trustee of the CBA. Their publication is called British Archaeology, and there's an article there called Surveying the Surveyor. So, you know, I like to be out in the field, and this relationship between map and field and map is something which I think we can usefully explore. One of the ways we might begin to think about that is to think about this idea of behind the lines of the map, and it's kind of what I'm beginning to think of as an archaeology of cartography, and I'm using archaeology here metaphorically, figuratively, as well as literally. So to think about how we can excavate the layers off the map, the features of the map, to get back to how it was created, but also thinking about archaeology as a kind of field practice in itself, and going back into the landscape and looking at the activities of these guys. You know, this is an image of I'm in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, and the Ordnance Survey in Ireland in the 1820s, 1830s were out in the field, measuring, taking their measurements, camping, creating those camps. You can see it there, setting up their survey stations, the beacon on the top right-hand side. There they are, dressed in their finery. So, you know, there's something to be said here for looking at not just maps, but thinking about maps in the context of the landscape and how the landscape has changed through maps and map making. So this is something I want to develop through this kind of talk, really, through this evening. And but by focusing on the maps of the First World War. These are British maps. I should sort of put some caveats in here. So we're looking at British military maps. I'm losing my voice already. Excuse me. So I like the example that you see in the background there. Topographic maps, 1 to 10,000, or ones I'm looking at mainly 1 to 20,000. So I'll be throwing around scales and various things as we go through this through this evening. So maybe getting it sometimes, focusing on the technical side of maps, but also thinking about mapping more broadly as well. And I really like this quotation from Alison Booth's postcards from the trenches here, to think about that relationship between the office, the work of the general here, as it says, occurs in the office, in the space of an office, or behind the lines in that sense. Then in the space of the battlefield, it's actually where the map really becomes so important, as a device, as a way of understanding the landscape, for surveillance, for understanding where the enemy positions might be situated, for those sort of forays across no man's land. We have all those images of the Western Front, I'm sure, in our minds, whether it's from poetry, whether it's from Blackadder or whatever. But the importance of maps in that theatre of war in between 1914 and 1918. So I'm going to be talking about the First War here. So I think what we're looking at here fits quite well with this theme of the Livingmaps Network, in and against the fog of war. Mappings from the front line. These are quite literally mappings from the front line that we're looking at here. And there is a developing critical literature on this. Peter Chasseau he is really probably the leading figure when it comes to British military mapping of the First World War, and produced an amazing book called The Topography of Armageddon, back in about quite a while ago, late 1990s, I think it might have been. And then more recently, Artillery's Astrologers, which I put it on its side there. You can see the thickness of that book. So, a huge amount of research. So I'm really only sort of scraping the surface, so to speak, of this topic compared to what's out there by the likes of Peter Chasseau. But let's go into the field of battle. Let's think about the context of these maps. So I thought this actually came up on Twitter recently. I know Twitter is in a bit of a kind of state at the moment, but it has its purposes sometimes. And this came up, and I just thought, fantastic! What a brilliant image. I mean, as you can see from the caption there, thinking about here, maps behind the lines, how maps were used in the fields. In a theatre of war. So this is a sketch of a dugout in Ypres in Flanders, December 1915, as you can see there, by this person Kelly. I think, presumably for those in this field, this is a well-known artist. But just look at what's going on there in that particular image. I mean, the most obvious thing is the map on the table. And how the map is being poured over, the red lines, the scribbles there, the trench systems, which these maps are so important for troops to understand where not only their own trenches were positioned, but also the enemy trenches, of course, and their gun emplacements and all the rest of it, the dugouts and so forth. But also, if you look over to the left-hand side on the bed, if you can call it a bed, you'll also see a couple of maps there again. So these are trench maps. So these are the kinds of maps that were being issued to the troops on the ground by the British military, also the other allied nations as well in the First World War, and also obviously the German troops as well. So maps were being used all across the different constituents of the First World War. But the way the map is just draped there, it's kind of casual, it's there, it's in the room, it's being used. I think I love this image just because it had that kind of casual feel to how the maps were just there, part of the fabric, part of the everyday life of a serving soldier. The maps behind the lines were always there, like an ever-present thing. And those maps were important, obviously, in the field of battle, but they also came with them a certain kind of language which we're familiar with. I mean, sometimes I think we take for granted cartographic literacy in inverted commas, our ability to read and understand what are often called conventional signs on a map. We know how to read a map, we know how to use a map, we know maybe familiar with an Ordnance Survey map and so forth. But the soldiers themselves were given instruction on this from these manuals of map reading and field sketching. This one is a revised edition from 1914. You can get these online, you can still buy them actually. But to kind of give you a flavor of the sorts of topics that are being taught to the troops, the folks on the ground, so to speak, behind the lines and serving on the front line. Map reading, as it says there, the use of scales, signs and lettering, sketching in the field as well, and some survey work too. So these are kind of very practical instruction manuals given to the serving soldiers. It says that you can see that the manual is intended for the use of candidates for commissions in the regular army and so on and so forth. So, you know, this was very much about instructing an ability in using maps. And the conventional signs, like these ones here, of course, you know, the kind of maps we're looking at that many of these troops will be using were fairly large scale and probably reasonably unfamiliar, because they were quite expensive. Ordnance Survey maps of large scale in the early 20th century, quite expensive to buy. It would be pretty unusual to see them. Smaller scale maps maybe, but not larger scale maps. So there had to be some instruction around this, and then also annotating maps as well, actually using maps as part of the intelligence, part of the information gathering process of annotation, sort of thing I'm teaching my students still now, actually. So the conventional signs and lettering, not only what appears on the map, but other ways in which to embellish the map, the kinds of things that obviously are important in a theatre of war, on the front line, on the Western Front. So all of that instruction is kind of going on and feeding into the use of these larger scale 1 to 10,000, which is around 6 inches to 1 mile in old money, or 1 to 20,000 was a slightly smaller reduced version of the 1 to 10,000 map produced at the time. And there were many, many different revisions of this. And Peter Chasseur, I've got a quotation there, up to in excess of 34 million maps issued for use on the Western Front. And that particular figure comes from that book on the right-hand side, which was a report written about survey on the Western Front after 1918, sort of taking stock, if you like. And they're the figures from that. And it says that, as you can see, 34 million at the bottom, maps produced by the Ordnance Survey, etc., etc. But, you know, to me, what's the most important line is actually at the bottom there. Stocks remaining in December 1918, after the armistice, amounts to nearly 3 million. So that the total issue to troops, you know, that's to me the key here. Issue to troops maybe taken as 31 million. So, you know, that's a lot of maps. I mean, when we think back to that image of the dugout to Ypres, you know, and those maps lying around, you know, that kind of casual use. So many, many, many maps being used on the Western Front. And I think after the war, it might be actually we can see some of the legacies of that familiarity with the Ordnance Survey or the larger scale topographic map like Ordnance Survey maps for Great Britain and for Ireland as well, like the 1-inch map, which became really quite significant as the 1930s, 1920s, the interwar period progressed, for encouraging rambling and these sort of leisure pursuits, cycling and so on, or motoring, as you can see there. And those beautiful covers that many people collect these maps now, these Ordnance Survey maps, these old 1-inch maps, popular edition, popular series, for their covers as much as anything is what lies behind within the covers, produced by an artist, Ellis Martin, you can see there. So, you know, that familiarity, I think, from the First World War of so many people using these maps maybe actually fed into some of that ability to pick up a map like that chap with the pipe there, work out where you are in the world, navigate by it, you know, have a very practical use. And much of that could, I suggest, have been, you know, helped along, if you like, by the familiarity of maps on the Western Front. There are other kind of legacies of the war on maps and survey. O.G.S. Crawford, who pioneered really aerial reconnaissance for map making during the First World War. He was on the Western Front. He was also important in the in the raising of archaeology as an important part of map making after the First World War, and incorporating a lot of archaeological features on maps. So there are lots of ways we can think about the legacies. So what I want to do in my talk really is to develop that story a little bit more. And that's really what I'm trying to do here over the course of the next sort of maybe half an hour or so, something like that. So I wanted to say something first of all about the context of the here and now, or at least the context of the centenary of the First World War, because the centenary of the war actually gave us today, I think, an opportunity to think about not only commemorating the war itself, but to think about how the war kind of lives on in the popular imagination, and how we need to try and understand what went on and how we engage with the past. So remembering and commemorating through maps and mappings is something that emerged through the Living Legacies Public Engagement Centre that Phil mentioned in the intro. Because this, what I'm talking about this evening really emerged through that public engagement exercise and some of the research we did as part of that. Then I want to look more in detail at, and I won't be spending much time on this, but just to sort of contextualize the period we're looking at, and also the mechanisms that were important in creating maps during the First World War by the British on the Western Front. Okay, lots of different kind of caveats there, but so that's really just focusing in on the kind of personnel involved, I suppose. And then I want to dig in much more into the maps themselves. So this is where I'm going to start excavating, to use our archaeological metaphors again, to start excavating the content of our trench maps, and especially thinking about how we can use 21st century geospatial technologies to analyze the accuracy of maps used on the Western Front. And I know one of my colleagues said to me, Paul L, his name is, back in about 2017 or 16, when we were looking at this, what if the maps were wrong? And he meant wrong in a kind of geodetic sense rather than kind of sort of factually wrong, or some way. He meant so let's say there was some systemic error in maps which were being used to create artillery bombardments and so on, which could have then had an impact actually on the successes and also failures on the front line. So that got us thinking really about how we can begin to analyze the accuracy of maps. And I'll be saying a little bit more about that, obviously, in that section. And I'm going to close really by going back to this idea that I think there is something important here in our agenda in looking at the field and sort of recognizing that what lies behind the map is the field. So let's go back into the field. All right, so mapping spatial technologies and the centenary really then is sort of setting the scene. I've mentioned already some of the important work by people like Peter Chasseau, but also really important in opening up the map to a much wider audience during the course of the last 10 years really has been geospatial technologies. The Linesman app, which you can load up onto your phone or your tablet with if it's GPS enabled, and you can go out into the landscape. You can actually navigate through a modern landscape using trench maps from 1916, 1917, etc., which is a really powerful way of connecting past and present when you're actually in the field and you're exploring the field. And then the National Library of Scotland, who've been really so helpful. Chris Fleet at NLS and his colleagues have done so much in making available to us historic maps, including those from the First World War, many of which I'll be using tonight, actually, or some of which I'll be using tonight. And within their online geographic information system, their web mapping application, giving us users the ability to layer up maps, historic maps, and overlay them onto modern aerial imagery, for example. So again, relating past to present, a really powerful tool to be able to use that. So, these technologies have been developing, the technologies of the time, of course, the very innovative time in the war itself. But now, 100 years later, these kinds of technologies are helping us to navigate these maps in new and interesting kinds of ways, I would suggest. And as part of the centenary of World War I, we got funding from the Arts and Humanities Research Council at Queen's University Belfast and created a public engagement centre called Living Legacies, and the strapline was from past conflict to shared future. Now, I'm not going to deviate that much to go into detail about that, but I did want to just highlight how me as a geographer and some of my colleagues wanted to use maps, mapping to help us understand the First World War, but also help us to understand the commemoration of the centenary as a practice today, so that to recognise the war has a continuing presence in our lives. So maps and map making were an important part of what we were doing through Living Legacies. We created tools like this one, which were using existing platforms like National Library of Scotland, as you can see there, but others as well, like the McMaster University online tool, which included trench names. And we knew there was a lot of interest because, you know, you might know your great uncle Billy had died in such and such a trench in such and such a place, etc. Though we wanted to try and help people to understand, you know, how we can use these maps to locate those cemeteries, those trenches, those trench systems, and so on, and using these platforms. So we did a bit of that kind of thing, really. But we also got out into the field, into the landscape ourselves, and exploring local landscapes and using 21st century geospatial technologies again, whether it's drone surveys, whether it's geographic information systems, ground penetrating radar in this case, or metal detectors in this case, to look at a lost warship station is near Whitehead, which is in County Antrim, so over here in Northern Ireland. So, you know, we want to try and use maps and map making as a way of engaging the wider community and to diversify the centenary. So to move away from simply looking at the infantry on the Western Front, to think about what's going on the home front, for example, and other kinds of experiences of war, including aviation. So this is a story map which we created. Rebecca Milligan, who is a researcher at Queen's with me, created this app, as she calls it, which is still live. So, you know, and that's the kind of thing we thought was, you know, an important thing to be doing during the course of the centenary. Paul L., my colleague, and Richard Grayson at Goldsmiths created this interactive map based upon research that Richard was doing on the service records for people in Belfast. And again, you know, using GIS here as a way of visualizing the locations of where people were, where they came from, who served in the Great War. So the home front was really important, I think, you know, bringing the home front to life for people through maps, but also bringing the Western Front home was another way we've used maps. So, you know, the Western Front, at least for us in Northern Ireland, is not the easiest place to get to. It's fine if you live in Sussex or Kent, but, you know, you can't exactly hop over to the battlefields. So we created, this is Conor Graham, my colleague at Queen's, created this 4D SOM, 3D in terms of the terrain, but fourth in terms of time, the dimension of time. So that was one thing that he was doing with us. And then it now looks like this. And this was another way of us trying to build bridges as well across the community divide here in Northern Ireland, between the different communities, nationalist and unionist communities here, through the centenary of the war, but using maps as a way of building those bridges and for helping people to understand the connections in the past between the communities, as well as, of course, in the present. Anyway, so all of that is that kind of, you know, where we were coming from in terms of situating this research. But let's go back to the First World War. Let's go back into the locations where these guys were using these maps and think a little bit more about what the maps represent and how they were made and so on. I was very fortunate working on this back in about 2017, I think it was, or yeah, 2016, 2017. And had the opportunity to go to Flanders, so to Ypres, and to revisit some of the sites where the maps were being made or surveyed in the field. And also to the, I think this is called in Flanders Fields Museum, isn't it, in Ypres? But, you know, these sorts of reminders of the place of maps in the everyday lives of those serving on the front line. This is a little exhibition, a little exhibit at the museum there in Ypres. Again, showing some sketch maps being drawn up and a little diary there, or journal. And visiting, this is a Messene or Mesen, in Flanders. So this is in Belgium now. And, you know, going into these places and trying to relate the landscape of the past to the landscape of the present. And we had linesmen with us to do that. So, you know, all of this was feeding into my thinking really about the maps themselves. So here's Messines, about the maps themselves. So I'm interested, as I said at the start, about thinking of the processes by which these maps were made through field work, as well as more the other sort of process of production, but particularly in the field and survey, especially the practices of field survey. Because you know, you can only imagine how difficult the conditions would have been before aerial reconnaissance really took off. Oh, sorry about that, literally in later on in the war, but early on, certainly ground survey was the way to go, and the difficulties that would have presented. So, and yet the maps were so fundamental to what the troops knew about what lay beyond no man's land. These are German trenches shown on this map here in red. So I was interested in that and did a little bit of work around this, digging around, looking at what was being written at the time by some fairly leading figures who themselves saw service and were very important in developing these maps on the Western Front, like Winterbottom. This map here just shows you the state of play, if you like, in 1914. The problem facing the British and the Allies really was that there was no standard uniform mapping of the area which became the Western Front. And there were different systems of mapping, large scale maps, like the 1 to 80,000 there for France, the fortress plans for the area around the borders between Belgium and France, a larger scale at 1 to 2,500 scale, I think. So there's quite a lot of variation, and what the challenge there in 1914 then was to try and systematize and make more uniform. And so the Geographical Section of the General Staff, the GSGS, created the series of maps, which you can see there. And the ones I'm focusing on today are the 1 to 20,000 maps, they were called artillery maps. They do show trenches, as do obviously the 1 to 10,000 trench maps, as they're often called. So there's this system of maps made, systematic maps were being made across the Western Front during the course of the war. Now, that process of map making, as you can imagine, with the British military, required some kind of organization. So this is from, again, a contemporary. It's something of the experience of what went on in the war, because people had to learn quickly. You know, this is obviously a challenging way of producing maps, and a need for maps as well, an essential need for maps. As you can see there from a little quotation at the top there, some optimistic assumptions that the maps were there, but they weren't, so they had to be made quickly. So the way that was done, and this is where Picasso's work is really helpful to us, was through the field survey companies, which were created in 1916. And you can see from the names there, something of the backgrounds of these people. They're all men. Of course, it's very much a masculine kind of endeavor, all of this. The Survey of India was where Wood came from, the Royal Engineer. Reed from the Ordnance Survey, Winterbottom, the Ordnance Survey, MacLeod, Survey of India, and Keeling, Survey of Egypt. You know, so these were the leaders, in charge of these field survey companies were pretty well experienced already. And what they had were groups of men, again, out in the fields and also behind the lines, doing various tasks and duties relating to map making, which included field survey work itself, of course. So there were people out in the field, the trig observers, as you can see there under occupations, also draftsmen, those people actually creating the maps themselves, and a whole host of others, including reprinters, the drivers. You know, there are lots of different occupations of those individuals concerned. So the experience then of the colonies seems to have a voice. You know, these are people who had that previous experience serving before the First World War, before 1914, in other parts of the then British Empire. And again, I don't think that's something which has really been particularly looked at, and I think would be an interesting thing to look at in a bit more detail. And then the influence of these individuals after the war itself. So Director Generals of the Ordnance Survey, of which two had seen service, Jack there 1922 to 1930, and then Winterbotham, who you've already, is his picture there as well, but all those who were instrumental on the front line. So what was going on the front line? I mentioned the aerial reconnaissance, but even aerial reconnaissance, when it was being used, still didn't necessarily solve all the problems. I mean, there were difficulties and challenges around early aerial reconnaissance anyway, but ground survey was always really very important, and that was particularly challenging. That quote there from Jack in that article: the greatest difficulty was experienced in preserving any kind of trigonometrical signal or picket. So these were the beacons. You remember in that image from Ireland from 1837, that beacon. So these are the, if you like, the infrastructure required for undertaking what's called a trigonometrical survey, which is an important part of the field survey element of making a map. So it was found that there was only one kind of monument that was respected by the Germans. And thereafter, every trigonometrical point was made secure by marking it grave of an unknown soldier of the Field Survey Battalion. So it's just a clever ploy by the British. So the trigonometrical survey is actually really a series of triangles, which themselves form a network, sort of control network. And it is, if you like, the skeleton on which you hang your maps. So without a trigonometrical network, it's very difficult to create an accurate series of maps. Remember, the British needed a series of maps. So the triangulation network are the fixed points in the landscape which were used to then work out where places were on the maps themselves. And underlying that trigonometrical network was field survey, being out in the field itself. So the guys doing this sort of work with their theodolites out in the field, and instructions on how to go about doing this sort of work, just as there was with the map instruction for the map reading as well. And coming up with lots of lists of trigonometrical stations and their coordinates. So each of these trigonometrical stations, which are these points on the map here with little names next to them, are fixed points. And observations are made between those fixed points using a theodolite. And you make up a whole series of these, so the triangles themselves form like a web or a network, control network. And that's what these guys are doing here. So all the different figures there relate to the positions of those, they're called stations, the trigonometrical stations. I'm not going to get too much bogged down into the kind of nuts and bolts of that. What I do want to spend some time on before I lose you all, is the main sort of outcomes of doing the research we were doing on these maps using our spatial technologies. So this is using geographic information systems and spatial analysis to think about the accuracy of, how well were these maps being surveyed on the ground, considering all the difficulties, and how accurate were they. So geographic information systems, spatial technologies, provide us with a set of tools really for analysing historic maps, and that's something that I've been working on with colleagues for quite a while now at Queen's, including the person who I should particularly mention here is Kat Porter, Dr. Kat Porter, University of Limerick now, but Kat and I really did this work together, so her name should be up here absolutely as well as mine. So we were interested in trying to analyse these trench maps, the larger scale topographic maps using GIS. There are many different applications of geographic information systems in looking at landscapes of the First World War, looking at digital terrain models and overlaying trench systems on those. Obviously, that's very helpful for us to begin to understand the defensibility of certain positions, and in an archaeological context as well on the right-hand side as well, using GIS to plot out the locations of trenches. And preserve, in some cases, are implementing conservation of those for cultural heritage management purposes. So there are GIS applications which are ongoing. Our application is slightly weird, slightly different to all of that. Like I said, we're kind of interested in the map, and there's really just two things you need. Well, one thing you need to really, I suppose, understand what we're trying to do here. On the left-hand side is the historic map with its features. On the right-hand side is a modern map. All we're trying to do here is work out how well the historic map on the left compares with the modern map on the right, kind of assuming the modern map is correct, of course. So we're using the modern map as a way of evaluating, measuring, analysing the accuracy of the historic map. I don't mean in terms of the features that it's showing, like the roads and so on, because they clearly change over time. When I talk about accuracy, what I'm interested in here is that trigonometrical network which underpins the map. Because if that's wrong, your map's going to be wrong, so you've got to have an accurate trigonometrical network in order to have an accurate map or usable map which has its positions in approximately the right places. So all we're doing here is comparing the historic maps with a modern map, but we're doing it using a geographical information system, and we're using a piece of software called Map Analyst, which is open source, to do that. Now, there's a little digression here to my part of the world over here on the island of Ireland. And the reason for that is because, well, one reason, map making and wall making goes back a long time before 1940 and 18, of course. So, I would give you a whole new lecture on the plantation of Ulster and its maps and map making and so on. The importance of maps for intelligence and all these sorts of things. But the reason I'm flagging it up here is it relates to the activities of a particular map maker called Josiah Bodley, about which we know not very much. But I've been working with CAT on maps by Josiah Bodley, and we've been using the same techniques which you're about to see for the trench maps. But the analyses are much more kind of obvious, or the results of the analysis I should say, are much more obvious in looking at maps of the 17th century than they are of looking at maps of the early 20th century. So that's really all I wanted to try. It's a kind of methodological point really I'm trying to make here. So I'm not concerned too much about the historical aspects. This is one of the maps produced by Josiah Bodley in 1609, 1610. So these are the English surveyors in Ulster mapping the topography, but especially the land divisions, townlands, they're called townlands. You don't really have townlands so much in England, but in Ireland, they're really important as a very small administrative unit. And the methodological point here is to say that we can analyse these maps by Josiah Bodley for their, in inverted commas, accuracy. So that is to say, how well do they relate to a modern map? And that's all we're doing here. But we're using that as a device to understand the differences, the geographical differences, the spatial differences in map accuracy, because we think that's important in telling us something about the map making process itself. So Josiah Bodley, we don't know much about him. We don't know what techniques he used in the field and so on and so forth. The maps are all we have. But by using, we digitize the map in a geographical information system. So we convert the map, again, I'm not going to go into the details too much unless you want them. We convert the map scan, the image, the raster it's called, into vector data, to the lines, polygons, and so on. And then we can begin to analyze those lines, polygons, because they're digital data, numerical data. And we can use our Map Analyst software to visualize variations in map accuracy. And I'm going to again use the scare quotes there. So very, very briefly on the left-hand side at the bottom here, there's this map of Loch Insulin, it's called, which is just west of Loch Ness, as you can see from the middle image at the top. The little blue lines are the townlands, which are shown by the Bodley map. And what we're doing here is we're relating those townland polygons to modern townland polygons. So there are methodological questions and difficulties there. But what we find, this is a grid called a distortion grid, which is an output from Map Analyst. Now, if the Bodley map was a one-to-one likeness with a modern map, it would be a perfect grid. So the lines would all be straight and they would intersect at right angles. But as you can see from that grid on the left-hand side here, you've got wavy lines and they don't intersect at right angles. So the grid itself is telling us something about distortion in that map image. So there are some parts of the map where it seems to be more squarey, the grid, and other parts where it's less squarey. So that's one, the distortion grid is one way of visualizing variations in cartographic distortion. That's all we're trying to do here. We can produce statistical outputs as well, which is really just another way of quantifying and visualizing that. But I just wanted to show you that one example, the distortion grid, because when we look at the examples in the First World War, you'll be thinking, they're so different, there's nothing like the kind of level of distortion that you're seeing there in that grid. Now, what we can begin to do with this then is to create what's called a lineage to actually look at these grids, these distortion grids, in a chronological way. That's what we're looking at there. This is work done by Symington et al. A few years ago for maps of Essex. And you can see each grid looks slightly different because each map has its own kind of distortion grid. It's like almost like a way of fingerprinting maps. So we can use these techniques to look at the maps from the First World War. And this is what Kat and I were interested in doing. And these are the three questions we were interested in addressing. To what extent did large-scale topographic mapping improve in accuracy during the war? What spatial variations in accuracy existed across the Western Front? And what effect did the warfare have on surveying and local accuracy of trench maps? And we're looking at, on the right-hand side there, the trench maps of 1 to 20,000, the index grid, and I'm going to focus in on area number 28 Southwest. So these are the map sheets that came from the National Library of Scotland. And as you can see, there's a whole sequence of them going from 1916 through to 1918. So we have a nice run of these maps. It's all the same location, just a different series of revisions. We also have from Peter Chassot's book, the trigonometrical stations and their coordinates in that table there. And we also have on the maps themselves, the trigonometrical stations marked. Okay, and you can see it here. It's that little circle with a dot in it. So going out into the fields, as you might expect, there's not much left of these trigonometrical stations. The image that unfortunately is covered over by the map image shows you the modern trigonometrical station. The tower, Kemmel Tower, which is in the area we were looking at, is on the right-hand side, but that's obviously a modern construction, a modern building. What we were able to do is extract from the maps the trigonometrical stations, which are listed there. We managed, of course, to locate those in terms of their modern latitude and longitudes, and also their position on the maps themselves, on the historic maps. And all we're doing is comparing one set of coordinates, which are the modern coordinates for these, with the historic coordinates. That's all we're trying to do here. Those are the trigonometrical stations we identified and which we mapped out. So they're kind of our sort of ways of actually making those connections between the historic maps and the modern maps. And these are the kinds of infrastructures, if you like, which are behind the trigonometrical stations we're looking at. They're quite ephemeral, aren't they, really? And as I said, all we're trying to do is connect or relate the historic map to the modern map. So that means identifying features on both, which are common to both, in this case, a church, which was a trigonometrical station. In the case of Messines, which you've seen already, the church was rebuilt after the war, pretty much on the same location, which was pretty commonplace. And inside the church itself, when we visited Messines, you can see some of the reconstruction of the church. The building was destroyed, but nevertheless rebuilt pretty much in the same location. So thinking about these questions then, the extent to which large-scale mapping, whether it's improved in accuracy, well, you know, I think if we begin to stack up these maps side by side, if you like, we can see changes because the landscape is changing. So the maps need to change. The revisions in the maps need to be made as the landscape changes. And of course, the battle line, the front line itself is quite fluid. So there's a little quotation there from Winterbottom about the recognizing how important the trench systems were as a subject for maps and map making. A better map was called for imperatively, and as such a map did not exist. We had to make one. And that's really what we're looking at here in this sequence of maps. So, I mean, this is really just running through from 1916, and you can begin to see how the maps themselves are changing in response to the way the landscape is changing as well. And also what I skipped over a moment ago is how even the trench colours were changed as well. Enemy trenches became blue and British trenches became red, whereas earlier on that wasn't the case. It was the other way around, which often confuses us today, of course. So those are the trench maps for Messines. It's all the same location, but you can see differences there as we go through. So, you know, we can think about accuracy in terms of what's being shown on the map. But as I said, what I'm interested in is that underlying control network, which is the trigonometrical network. And as Winterbottom is saying there, in making a map of any large area, it's essential to start from a good framework of triangulation. Okay, so these triangles are really important in setting out the accuracy of those maps. The French geodetic triangulation network was tied into the British triangulation network that went back to the 18th century and the start of the Ordnance Survey under William Roy. So there was that kind of network already in place, and it was supplemented with new triangulation networks, new trigonometrical networks. And the area we're looking at is this area. Kemmel is that where that tower was you saw just a moment ago. So the trigonometrical stations themselves have different origins, which again is perhaps something we need to bear in mind in looking at the maps themselves. Was this a factor in how accurate or not certain parts of these maps might or might not have been? The British, the Belgium, and the French. We did our analyses. I'm again not going to spend too much time on this really, but to look at the relationship between the positions on the historic maps of those stations with their current coordinates. And the best fit line, the regression line, shows a very close relationship, very close correlation between the two sets of coordinates, which basically means they did a very good job. Okay, now I could stop there and say, okay, that's it, job done. But there are some interesting things to look at, the variations over time, eastings and northings, if we separate them out and look at the correlation again, it's called an R-square, the regression value. There are differences over time, which again suggests perhaps there is some variation in map accuracy over time. We can use our distortion grids. You now know what a distortion grid is. But what you'll see, this is why I wanted to show you those Bodley maps from the 17th century. They are very straight. They are very grid-like. So again, when we look at the outputs from our distortion grids from Map Analyst, and we just run through the sequence, 1916, 1917, very square grids. Okay, so again, looking pretty good. We can't really be too critical. So Kat and I thought, well, okay, we could just say, well, that's it, they were very accurate. But there is a little tool that you can play around with. It's called an exaggeration factor. And she said, look, if you do this, then it can really bring out some of the more subtle differences and variations. So we tried that. And this is on the left-hand side is what happens for our 1916 sheet, okay? And you can begin to see here that some parts of the map sheet, there do now seem to be some areas of greater distortion. You see where the grid is more distorted and other areas less so. And we thought, well, okay, that's kind of interesting and maybe it means something. So we ran it through all the different maps, 1917, as you can see there. And it wasn't the same part of the map each time. There were different variations in different parts of the map sheet for different dates. And again, I thought, well, okay, what does that mean? Why is that happening? Is it something to do with the impact of the war itself on the positions of those, if they're resurveying those trigonometrical stations, perhaps that has having an influence. And we found some displacements in trig stations, particularly in the area around Kemmel, which is what we're highlighting there in blue, okay, which is where you saw that tower. And maybe that's to do with the fact that you've got 2 different or 3 different triangulation systems being brought together in one place, or maybe it's because the trigonometrical network is being impacted by the war itself. So the third question, what effect did warfare have? What effect did it have on the maps themselves and their accuracy, was the kind of third thing we were interested in looking at. Now, recognizing where we are on the Western Front, this was much fought over ground. It's highlighted there, sheet 28 southwest, just around Messines, just south of Ypres, if you can see that there. So very much fought over piece of ground with different offensives and counter offensives, as you can see here, between 1917 and 1918, as the front line went backwards and forwards between the Allied troops and the Germans. Distortion, we thought, well, this is kind of interesting because there does seem to be distortion in some of those areas where there was quite an interesting backwards and forwards interplay between the offensive and the counter-offensive. And we can never be totally definitive, obviously, about this, but it did seem to be at least suggestive that some of those places which were on our exaggerated maps, distortion grids, there seemed to be more distortion. There did seem to be some connection there with these areas of the front line, which were much more contested and fought over. And that leads us to think a little bit about, okay, what was going on the ground and how difficult it was to survey on the ground with these trigonometrical stations and these beacons, as you can see here. Right, nearly finished. So where does this take us then? Thinking through maps is the title of the book I'm trying to write. So some future directions for us. Well, from the process of analysing the maps, we can see, there are some useful applications of these spatial technologies. I think it's something which we could do more with in looking at historic maps, even of the early 20th century. There was a hint at nonlinear progress, and that's looking at that graph that I showed you, I skipped over, that maybe mapping is not necessarily always, in inverted commas, getting better, that there will be differences over time as well as space. The spatial variations themselves might relate to activities on the front line. And what it highlights, underpinning all this, is the importance of trigonometrical survey, which you saw in that quotation from Winterbottom as well, which goes back to these guys. And that's where I'm really going to end now, to think about not so much the map image, which I guess is what we've been obsessing about, but the field which lies behind the map, and going back into the fields to think about how the map making process itself goes from field to map, but how we ourselves perhaps might need to go from map back into the field to recover some of these sites. And that's what I've been doing with my colleague Satish Kumar here at Queen's University Belfast, in looking at the Great Trigonometrical Survey of India. And again, more map making, more war making, but this time a colonial context. And the survival of the tower on the right-hand side was constructed to a model designed by George Everest. It's a whole new talk, but this is a broader theme, I think, of trying to make connections between maps and landscapes, so going behind the map, looking behind the map to the fields, and looking behind the lines, okay, folks, behind the lines on the map itself. Okay, some acknowledgements there. Just to note, our help from the Imperial War Museum with Fergus Reid, and also NLS with Chris Fleet. Thanks, everybody. Phil, I'm afraid you're muted.
No. Yes, okay. I think I'm unmuted now, yes?
You are.
Yeah, good. Good. Well, just to thank Keith very much for that fascinating talk. And I think granularity was the name of the game, and really sort of focusing down into the kind of nitty-gritty of military map making. So while people are getting their breath back, as it were, and please do use the chat facility, but also just if when I'm just going to say a few words and then hand it over to people to kind of comment and ask questions. Well, there were two, a couple of substantive points. A lot of the maps that you were referring to were dated 1916. So I was just wondering, what maps were being used prior to that date. So if you could just maybe expand a little bit on that. Mm-hmm. And then there's a sort of broader question about how kind of inscriptive these maps were. In other words, when trenches were being dug, when they were being when people were deciding where to dig them, right? To what extent were those decisions informed by existing cartographies or by actual perceptions of the territory, on the ground, if you like, from the field rather than from the map? So that's the sort of second substantive sort of issue. And then I think there's a more broadly based thing, which I think Livingmaps are particularly interested in, which is, I don't know if you know this painting by Stanley Spencer of map making in the First World War. It's a rather famous painting. What it shows is it's a kind of top-down view of a trench, and there's the officer who's there with the map, and the Tommies are all sort of lying around him. It's almost like a bedtime story. It's like he's reading the map, and they're all sprawled around, looking rather relaxed, actually. As an image of the sort of ways in which people made themselves at home in the trenches, and the kinds of if you like, the mental maps that people develop. I mean, of course, there are also these rather famous maps showing the Tommies renamed a lot of the trenches. They called them Piccadilly Circus and Leicester Square and so on. So they kind of renamed and, of course, rehomed, made this strange, bizarre landscape, horror really, familiar and almost homely by the kind of naming process. And these kinds of if you like spontaneous mapping processes, which I mean, to what extent any of that impacted on the official cartographies, and secondly, you the legacy of the First World War and the kind of memoryscapes that have been kind of created around it, and not only by maps, of course, but by films and poetry and fiction and all sorts of things. But I wondered if you could say, I don't know whether your research has gone into this, but I mean, in your platform that you set up, have people used it to upload their own kind of family memories or histories of the First World War? Have any of the sort of memoryscapes that kind of get transmitted through families, through stories? Did any of that sort of register on your platform? So I suppose I'm just asking a bit about the unofficial cartographies of the untrenched maps. If you could say a bit about that.
Yeah. Well, maybe I hope keep me right if I've forgotten something. But the platforms we created were based upon, I'm thinking the one I showed you on service records. But there are ways, the ability is there to be able to populate these maps, and some really good work. Layers of London, for example, doing, and HuMap doing similar things, plotting out on maps using GIS basically to plot out stories, people's stories, post stories, photographs, etc., etc. So the technology, we weren't using it specifically for that purpose, but it could be, and it is being used for that kind of purpose. We were interested really in trying to look at the service records from the time, from 100 years ago, and locating people in that sense. And again, a lot of work was done on that during the centenary. National Lottery Heritage Fund funded a number of community-based projects, mapping projects, which usually involved a local organisation, local history society, etc., gathering information about service personnel from their area, from their parish, from their community, and mapping it. And in different kinds of ways, not always really using a GIS, but could be using quite analog methods, paper type of methods of simply plotting out where people had lived before they went to serve, and in many cases obviously did not come home, and then in some cases went out into the local landscape and put poppies on those houses because the houses were still there for those people who served. So they very much a kind of community engagement type approach to using maps and mappings. So that's more kind of, I suppose, kind of grassroots, perhaps less official, if you like, perhaps, compared to what we were doing, but it was certainly very popular during the course of the centenary. The names of the trenches, yes, I think one of the things, when you look at those earlier trench maps, you mentioned 1916. So after 1916, the field survey companies are set up, but the maps are there before then, but they don't show trenches, so very few of them show trenches. Even after 1916, the British trench systems on the British lines were not shown in detail. So the fear was, of course, those maps could fall into enemy hands, and then clearly that would be quite a disaster to show the positions, the British positions. So it was really only the enemy trench systems which were shown earlier on. That did change during the course of the war. The trench systems on both sides did get represented by 1917, 1918. So there were what are called secret editions or secret maps, which were produced, for example, in the Battle of the Somme, which did show the British positions, the trench systems, as well as the German trench systems. And they are obviously fascinating things to be looking at, because they do record those Piccadilly circuses and so on and so forth, those sort of trench names that we are kind of curious about now, but they kind of really humanize that landscape and connect what was really hostile place to places from home you know, and very powerful and emotive place names in the trench systems. So I kind of answered there, hopefully, a bit of some of your questions. But the 1916 one, the whole sequence of maps really gets going after about 1916 with the field survey companies being set up. There is an inherited set of maps of different scales, and it's those that they were trying to harmonize, really, I would say.
Thank you. Okay, well now we've got something from Andrew Hobley here. Do you want, Andrew, to unmute yourself and actually say something, make a comment? Yep, go on.
Sure. It must have been dangerous surveying near the lines. Have you any idea how many surveyors became casualties? I wondered if that sort of report of the war work mentioned in passing how many, if any, became casualties.
Yes, the thing to look at here is some work done by Clive Bucock, and he created a memorial, an online memorial to those people from the Ordnance Survey who served throughout the First World War, actually. Now, I've not done any analysis on that, to be fair, but I would suggest that, you know, Clive's work and that, in effect, a kind of data set that he's got there of service personnel who were employees of the Ordnance Survey, but they did see service on the front line. Now, there would also have been many, many others as well who were not former Ordnance Survey employees, which were being trained up and equipped to be able to do the survey work, who would also have lost their lives in that process. So I'm afraid I can't actually give you a figure for that. So, you know, Clive's work is probably the best thing. And if you're interested, I can certainly, well, maybe you can even Google, if you Google Clive Bucock, and he produced this online memorial to the Ordnance Survey for the First World War. I think he did it in about 2014, and it's still there. You can still access it. So if you're interested, you could access that.
Keith, do you want to type that into the chat? Maybe that reference.
Yes.
That? Might be helpful.
Okay, if I can find it.
Okay, well, not to worry if not. Now, anybody else, you know, got some a comment, a question? Ian or Jack? I mean, we're a small group. I think it's perhaps something to do with a certain football match that's taking place, but who knows? Today. Well. Okay, what are you doing? Just well, another point, I suppose. I was very interested in your. It was a sort of bit of a tease in a way, but you talked about the war legacy, how with all these millions of maps being used by you know, by the soldiers, and then you know, this kind of interest in maps in the post-war period. I mean, the map you showed was kind of interesting because it showed this rather kind of idealized. I mean, you can't judge a map by its cover, let's say, but you know, the cover shows a rather idealized picture of the English countryside, and of course, during the war, both in the First and the Second World War, the image of the nation was a very important part of like the kind of war effort of the war propaganda machine. And often they did draw, I mean, they didn't put up pictures of, you know, the dark satanic mills in the industrial heartland of the country. They put up images of this kind of rural, and especially in the Second World War, it's more ironic really, because, you know, industrialization had been around a long time. But anyway, they had this kind of rural image of this is what the country was fighting for. This was the image. So I just wondered if you know, when you were thinking about the sort of legacy thing and this project you've been doing, whether you thought a bit about that, the sort of the image of the nation that was being on the cover, and how that related to what was actually in the maps.
Well, yeah, I might answer that in a slightly different way if I may. I mean, you're right. So that imagery is highly romanticized. It's very bucolic. It's very pastoral. you know, evokes all sorts of things, very English, a very kind of picturesque view of, you know, an English England, you know, and it's very rural as well, as you say. It's not at all an urban image, very pastoral, very idyllic. And there's work by geographers and others on that, like Kate Brace and so on, who've been very much interested in those sorts of illustrations, and not just from the First World War, but for, as you say, the interwar period and after as well. No, I think the thing being in Northern Ireland, the First World War is different to how it is really during the centenary of the war in England. So in England, broadly speaking, people would wear a poppy on Remembrance Sunday. You might go to your local village green and lay a wreath and so on. You know, and it's seen very much often as a kind of collective thing, really, still in England. But in Northern Ireland, it's very different. And the point of Living Legacies was, and the name itself hints at this really, was to recognize that the First World War isn't just sort of dead history. It lives on. It has a resonance. It's still very powerful. And there was, in this part of the world, at a very high political level, concern about what would happen in 2016 with the centenary of the 1916 Easter Rising, which obviously would be significant for the nationalist community, and also the significance for the unionist community, especially of the Battle of the Somme. So 2016 was really critical. And I think that ties into that, the broader point you're making there about, you know, nationalism with a small n, as opposed to nationalism in Northern Ireland context, you know, and how that is different, you know, how it is different in different places. And some of that bucolic imagery for the English map speaks to an English kind of audience, whereas over here it's a different kind of dynamic. And commemoration, therefore, is much more, I would suggest, much more difficult, troubled, controversial, contentious, like the past is in Northern Ireland. Not just in Northern Ireland, many parts of the world. You know, the past is not always that kind of easy, comfortable thing. It's very difficult and challenging. And that's all we were trying to do through this work with Living Legacies, is just sort of find ways of creating a dialogue between communities by looking at the past through different kinds of mechanisms, including mapping.
Right, thank you. Jack Bond, I think you raised a hand at some point. So would you like to unmute yourself and make your comment? Or you decided you had raised a hand at one point?
Oh,
oh, it says not me. Well,
it might have been me again.
Okay, go on.
In the context of the Northern Ireland, the Ireland World War I, my ex-wife's grandfather was killed on the Somme.
Mm-hmm.
Before the war, he'd been a member of the Ulster Volunteer Force, had been involved in the SS Clyde incident, importing 40,000 German guns. So if the war hadn't started by 1950, he'd have been probably shooting at British soldiers.
Mm.
As it is, he's lying in a British war grave. So it's one of the ironies of then you've got obviously the Easter Rising stuff as well. So
that's right.
People in Ireland who, if history had gone in different directions, wouldn't be war heroes, inverted commas. They'd be something else, depending on where you're sitting on the political landscape.
Yeah. There was one of the collaborators with us was a playwright called Brenda Winter Palmer, and she wrote a play called The Medal in the Drawer, and that was all about her. She came from a Roman Catholic background in West Belfast, and she remembered as a child having this war penny. Nothing was said about it. It was a kind of skeleton in the cupboard almost for a Catholic family in West Belfast to have this, to say that they fought, you know, in the Somme or the Western Front. And she wrote the play about this because there has been this sort of recognition that from both sides of the community, here's what Richard Grayson has written about as well, you know, recognition that both sides of the community divide here played a role in service on the Western Front, you know. So that was part of what we were trying to do through Living Legacies, is just explore that as kind of gently as we could.
It just comes to mind that there's a play by, having seen him, I can't well-known Irish playwright, which is features this sort of debate really between these two cartographers. One of them is English and one of them is Irish.
Oh, right.
They're going around. Do you know the one the play I'm talking about?
Yeah.
And the irony is that it's the English guy is saying, well, and they're renaming places and anglicizing them. And it's the English guy is demurring about this and saying, well, should we be doing this? Shouldn't we just be using the original kind of Irish names? And the Irish guy is saying, no, we want to have a map with, he's kind of spun it around. But
yeah, that's Brian Friel.
That's right, Brian
Friel.
Yes,
they wrote the play called Translations.
Yes. And
it was performed in Derry, Londonderry, I think first in around 1980, 81, that kind of time. So Brian Friel was one of our leading figures at Queen's, actually. And Translations itself presents the story, as you say there. It presents the story of the Ordnance Survey in Ireland in the 1820s, 1830s in the northwest around County Donegal. But it really, in itself, it was quite strongly criticised actually by John Andrews, who is no longer with us actually, but he was an historian of cartography, a geographer based. He was in London, in Dublin at TCD, Trinity College, Dublin. And anyway, he wrote a book called The Paper Landscape, which is about the Ordnance Survey on the island of Ireland and its work and its practices and so on. And in a more later edition anyway, after the Brian Friel play came out, he tried to sort of argue against Friel, because I think he felt Friel had slightly, well, as you would with performing arts and creative arts, you want to create a drama out of this, so maybe he sort of, spun a particular line about it. And Andrews, played a very straight bat, really. He just worked very much with the written records. Was not very happy about that, to try to correct, in his view, Friel's translation. So yeah, it's a really interesting, not just Friel himself, but the kind of way this still today actually has a kind of degree of contestation around this, and the story of the Ordnance Survey on the island of Ireland. It's an interesting, and we're about to have the bicentenary of the Ordnance Survey here. And I've got another project which is ongoing at the moment on the bicentenary of the Ordnance Survey. Because again, in Ireland, things are different. So the Ordnance Survey here, different Ordnance Survey, 2 Ordnance Surveys actually on the island of Ireland, north and south. And still very much important in terms of popular culture, like Brian Friel's Translations. Still really important. Yeah.
Great, okay. Right, well, any more?
They want to watch the football, I think.
But anyway, we've recorded this, and I know there's quite a number of people, Livingmappers too, who wanted to come. Some have children. I mean, it's complicated, but anyway, we recorded this, and we will be posting a slightly edited version, but mainly just obviously your presentation on our website. So please, tell your friends that if they've missed this, then they can catch up. It'll take about a week or 10 days, I think, to get it on there. But we always do that with all our talks, so they're up there. Right. So I think it just remains to really to thank Keith really for tremendous talk, and really putting it. It's a very complex set of issues that you had to negotiate and map indeed, which you did. And I've learned a lot, and I hope others have too. And so thanks for that. And just a word about the next events in this series. They're going to be a live event, but also streamed, where they're being held at the Pushkin Centre House, I should say, Pushkin House in Bloomsbury, WC1. And the one in January is about Cold War cartography with Alexander Kent and John Davis, who've made a study of Soviet maps and how they are much more accurate than the Ordnance Survey. Well, they put in a lot of stuff that you can't find on the Ordnance Survey because they didn't want people to see it. I mean, it's very interesting. So anyway, it's so that's on January the 18th. So you could, people can come to Pushkin House, or they can watch it online. And then on February the 16th, we've got a session on mapping war crimes and human rights abuses with Stephen Graham, people from the Centre for Information Resilience and Forensic Architecture. That's going to be a tremendous session. I think that's also live but streamed. So, you know, so we're covering, I'm going to say, we're covering a lot of ground in this series anyway. So anyway, so thanks very much to Keith.
Thank you
for tonight, and thank you all. Thanks for coming.
Thanks. See you soon.